Hi, everyone. I'm Greg Gershuni, the Executive Director of the Aspen Institute's Energy and Environment Program. Our work is focused on exploring significant challenges in our society, particularly around climate change, with diverse thinkers and doers to help create a more prosperous, equitable, and sustainable society for all. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, today's event is the second in a series focused on the future of cities and reimagining our urban epicenters to better serve both people and the planet. This series is in collaboration with REEF Technology and Blueprint, those whose headquarters are in Miami, which makes today's conversation with Mayor Levine Cava particularly relevant, and whose mission is to connect the world to your block by transforming underutilized urban spaces into neighborhood hubs that connect people to local goods, services, and experiences. We all have different ideas on what the future of cities may look like, from green architecture to changing mobility to different uses of existing buildings. Today, I'm looking forward to diving into what we need to reinvent and rethink in order to create cities that serve us better and contribute to a more equitable and sustainable lifestyle. The conversations we're having here will help inform a proposal of big ideas that will release later this winter to help us shape the future of urban life. Now, I'm pleased to introduce Nicole Flado, who is the managing editor for Bloomberg City Lab, where she oversees coverage on urban policy and the future of cities. Over to you, Nicole.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here. First, I'm going to be chatting with Mayor Daniela Levine Cava one-on-one, and then we're going to open it up to some other panelists. And as was just said, a focus of my everyday work is the future of cities. So conversations like this one are really the bread and butter of what we do. Mayor, thank you very much for making the time to be here, even today as we speak. I know you're in the midst of all kinds of challenges related to COVID and vaccine distribution. And that's kind of where I want to start our conversation. We are having a broader conversation today about a new era for cities, how they need to change, how we need to rethink how we build and design cities. And I'm sure that's something that you is part of your thinking and vision all the time. But at the same time, governments are always under so much strain and more now than ever. And I want to recognize that there's the ideal and then there's reality of trying to run a city during the pandemic, among other things. I want to start by asking you how you think about incorporating bigger questions about rethinking design in the built environment at a time when the most immediate strains are so severe.
Yeah, so it is true that I never planned to be the mayor of Miami-Dade County in the middle of a pandemic. I guess for me, the fact that I've always worked on issues of resilience and equity means that through the lens of a pandemic, those issues come to the forefront all the more and create greater public awareness about those issues. And we do want to be sure that recovery is not to the lowest common denominator, but to the highest common denominator. And that would be true both from a building perspective, dealing with the rising seas, and also from an equitable perspective, making sure that our rising tide will lift all boats and we'll be able to deal with income and wealth disparities and not just proceed, as is often the case with recoveries from recessions, to allow the rich to get richer and those at the bottom to stay at the bottom. So I think it's a real challenge. It's a worthy challenge. We are all in it together. That's the good news. And Miami-Dade County is very familiar with crisis. We have the hurricane season that seems to last about half the year. We have the fact that we have always incorporated people coming from foreign lands, from other parts of the country. So we are very good at adaptation and change. And that's how we're going to incorporate these new ideas.
Thanks. As a follow-up question, we're at the end of a week of new administration after another week of federal tumult. What would be most helpful to you, either from this new federal government or the private sector or other actors, to make that planning and long-term thinking just a little bit less of a strain?
This administration, right out of the box, is launching new ideas, obviously restoring certain protections and safeguards and framework around the environment that is so needed and refreshing. But also, I know will be a pipeline for innovation. And that is what we need. We need to have a national government that encourages us to learn and grow with a new economy. We can't just go back. We have to go forward with new ideas. And I'm very excited, not only that we'll be getting that pipeline of ideas, but dollars. I think we're going to be investing in infrastructure that is forward-looking. We'll be investing in intellectual pursuits that are forward-looking. So I'm very excited that I'll have that backup and that that treasure trove of like a learning and doing lab from the federal government. Now I'm going to do that myself in Miami-Dade County, drawing upon our incredible universities and entrepreneurial culture. I always do things together, collaboration, my middle name, but the main point about the federal government is they have a very, very important role to play in, and I'm very grateful that we'll have that pipeline.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned previously in your first comment that you are viewing this crisis as an opportunity to elevate some of the ways that we need to rethink our cities as well. What do you envision as the most stark way that your county might be different when we come out the other side of this in your ideal scenario? In other words, what are the most prominent opportunities of this crisis, or even just the mandates in thinking about how we change?
Well, we're very much in the news as the new not Silicon Valley. We do have lots of big firms and tech innovators interested in the lifestyle we have here. Now that more people can work virtually, why not live someplace that is a delight? So we are definitely capitalizing on that and doing our very best to lure jobs here. And those are jobs that diversify our economy, jobs that pay well, that cater to pipelines for our local residents as well as our college graduates, and that is very, very promising. The other thing is that people are more concerned about the environment. They are interested in parks and recreation and open spaces. So there's a special appreciation of our unique beauty, and that is helping us draw people, but also putting more energy and dollars into protecting and preserving our environment.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up this idea of a new Silicon Valley. Actually, I wasn't thinking of it quite that way, but that's a good way to describe it as well. I want to ask you a little bit more about that. Do you see it as, I guess you see it as partially a boon, but perhaps also a challenge to have new interest in your city from kind of tech folks or wealthier folks? Are you anticipating an influx of people in the way that has sometimes been described, or is the idea maybe to foster the Silicon Valley culture from within? How are you thinking about or planning for this idea of a potential migration, or is that even what it is?
Yeah, we are having a lot of conversations about that, a lot of chat conversations. I'm on a lot of WhatsApp and Clubhouse and a lot of different streams. And we're looking at an ambassador program to attract people. But the challenge for us is how to do it in an equitable way. So we have real dynamism and creativity right here in Miami-Dade County. And we don't want to let the newcomers eclipse that dynamism. We really are a unique place. We 70% primarily Spanish speaking, very global international population, a lot of people coming here part of the year. As well, we have a culture of our Black community, a Caribbean community that has been here for generations and been the building block of our community. So, we really need to find ways that as we grow, that we incorporate and include the best that we have to offer and create opportunities. So that is really a big part of my focus for women, for communities of color, for people from different backgrounds. And I'm finding in talking to some of these company leaders that that's what draws them to Miami. It's the diversity, the dynamism. And so we have to recognize that we have to work hard to protect, preserve, and grow that, or we will lose that unique flavor. And we will be doing an injustice to those who live here and need the opportunities as well, and have the skills and the creativity to deliver.
Yeah. And what do you think is the most prominent way that you can incorporate those folks into these opportunities? Is it training and education?
We have some incredible training organizations already, very diverse and unique, and working with young people. So we have to elevate those, we have to support those, and we need to make sure that our employers are utilizing those, right? So, there's this disconnect where employers will say, oh, there isn't, we don't have people here with the technical skills. And then we have people with the technical skills saying we can't get the jobs. So obviously there's a disconnect. Communication is challenging in our community. We're many diverse communities. So this is part of my job as county mayor, to make sure that we connect the opportunities, the offers with those who are seeking. So that's going to be my job.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay. I want to talk about climate and resilience a little bit. We have a question here from the audience that I'd like to start with. I'd be interested in hearing, he says, about the ways that you're thinking about funding and financing resilient infrastructure, either a traditional or creative way. And this gets back to some of the budgetary strains.
Yeah. So we're no stranger here to sea level rise and climate change. My other nickname is Water Warrior. I've become obsessed with the quality of our fresh water, which is from the Everglades, and that really then pertains to Everglades restoration, which is a national priority that we have to make sure we deliver on. A third of all of Florida gets its fresh water from the Everglades, and to the extent that we have diked and plugged and diverted and polluted, that puts our water system at risk. We also have the rising seas, and because of the slowing down of the Gulf Stream, we have the most assets at risk of any place in the world. And then that salt water is also intruding into our fresh water supply, our wells. So we have, all of those, as well as pollution of our fresh water from runoff, from fertilizer, construction, the heating up of the waterways. So we have a lot of challenges to protect and preserve our waterways. So we are focusing in the short term on things like septic to sewer conversion, because we have a lot of septic systems that are compromised by the rising sea and run off into our bay. We also are looking at an antiquated water and sewer system that's under federal court decree to be rebuilt, and how we can accelerate those rebuilds. The largest infrastructure project in Florida history, by the way. And I did not mention before that infrastructure is a key part of our economic rebuilding as well. And we're trying to accelerate those projects. And those are good jobs as well for our local community. But larger climate issues, we were part of the 100 Resilient Cities, Rockefeller, and that's morphed into the next phase. We have a Resilience 305 plan with our first year report we released last week. And I am very aggressive on carbon reduction, solar conversion, building efficiency, fleet efficiency, infrastructure for electric vehicles. So all of those things will put us at the forefront under my administration of working to do our part to achieve the Paris Climate Treaty, which we did adopt even during the last administration as a county. So we are going to move forward aggressively to set those goals and achieve them. And how do we pay for it? I think that was the question. How do we pay for it? Well, we're going to do some creative financing. We're going to get some federal help and state help. We're going to, there are some different ways of creating maybe social impact bonds, working with our bond portfolio. So we're going to be doing a deep dive into the ways that we can first and foremost move the septic to sewer issue forward, because that is an immediate risk to our bay. Solar pays for itself. Electric conversion pays for itself. So, we can work smarter and get this job done.
So you've just named a number of types of infrastructure, which are all going to be really important. And it's already, as you mentioned, the sewer challenge is kind of an immediate one, and clearly you have your plate full. I'm going to mention another one related to climate, which is public transportation. What which isn't as popular of an option in Miami-Dade as it is in some other large urban areas. And nationally, internationally, actually, there's unique strains on funding to expand public transportation now under COVID. Do you have priorities in terms of how you're thinking about expanding public transportation in Miami, especially now with essential workers disproportionately utilizing it?
Well, we had a town hall meeting on this subject last night. Incredible. We put out the word about a week ahead that we were going to be discussing when to go back to paying paid fares, because we've been utilizing longer than most places the subsidy coming from the Federal CARES Act for free transit. And that was important. Obviously, people were financially affected and they couldn't afford. But also for essential workers, we needed to be sure we did have public transit for them and to help them through this critical time. We had to add vehicles because of the spacing requirements. We had to add the sanitizing, plexi, rear door boarding, all kinds of things on our buses for protection. And we obviously need to continue those sorts of protections. But we do not have good transit in Miami-Dade County, sort of an understatement. We were at 4% ridership before the pandemic, and that is down in the pandemic. Traffic is coming back along with our economy, and so they are filling back up. We have some aggressive plans. There's something called the SMART plan, which moves 6 corridors forward for rapid, let's call it choice rapid transit, so major corridors that will draw people out of their cars. So we want choice riders. And we also have a better bus project redesign that will add frequency and reliability to the most utilized routes. All of these things are taking a little time, but at least we're moving forward. And it's been many years that the public transit improvements have been stalled. We have a great opportunity for anyone listening or anyone you know. We are looking for a new director of our Department of Transportation and Public Works, and we want someone who will be forward thinking, look at total mobility, first mile, last mile, bicycle safety, you name it. And by having public works merged with transportation, it's an opportunity to design a whole system. So we're looking for really great people to move us forward aggressively so we can become a world-class transit hub as well.
Thank you. Pivoting away from that idea, I have a bold question from an audience member that I think is a good one to close out our conversation. How do you feel about the idea that we should invest in managed retreat from cities like Miami instead of investing in infrastructure that will just delay but not stop sea level rise and its effects?
So the state of Florida just put out a tool for statewide planning around sea level rise. So I have to double check that their projections are the same as our multi-county regional planning compact. Look, the seas are rising. We're going to do our very best to reduce that, but at the same time, clearly we have to plan. We are a choice destination for the world, and there are choice benefit analyses that have to be made, but we are not planning any imminent retreat. We're working with the Army Corps around a major study and plan to help with flooding. We are obviously doing our building codes and our road infrastructure and the like to comport to rising sea levels. So, we have to be smart about it. We have to make a benefit, as I say, cost benefit analysis of what is the infrastructure that we should invest in making more resilient versus what are things that don't have a longer term horizon or benefit. So it's a new way of looking at it. We're finding ways for our water to drain through porous roads and parks. We're doing the septic and to sewer and sewer and water system rebuild. So we're well on our way to creating a long-term horizon, and that's the plan.
Does it surprise you on that note that new folks are potentially migrating to your county?
Well, I think that's kind of what I'm saying is that people are still voting with their feet or their car or their airplane or however they get here, they want to be here. And I don't think that our climate issues are a secret. So there's clearly an appetite for continuing to keep our place alive, even as we have to be truthful, we have to be forthright, we have to make sure the public understands the risks and the infrastructure that is going to be needed to keep us thriving.
Well, thank you so much, Mayor. I don't think I mentioned at the outset that you just started your term in November and already finding yourself in the midst of multiple challenges, including I know some vaccine distribution challenges that most places are facing. And so I know you'll have to be leaving to address that, but I really want to thank you for taking just a few minutes during what I know is a really overwhelming time to think about these big questions.
It's the most exciting that I get to do. We have to deal with the crisis, but we have to look forward to a brighter future. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. I'm going to transition there to our other panelists who I think will be appearing on the video. And I can just describe them as they start to do that. So joining us, we're going to have a few others. Mark Falcone, who's founder of Continuum Partners, LLC. It's based in Denver and a firm that's focused on developing complex mixed-use urban infill projects. He can tell you more about its kind of progressive first values. I see some folks are starting to join here. So Emily Talon has joined us. She's a professor of urbanism at the University of Chicago, who is known for the countless citations to her long record on urbanism, equity, walkability, and a lot of the questions that are going to be core to our conversation here. And lastly, for this next part of our conversation, we will have Federico Negro, who's the founder of the Canoa Supply Company, a design firm and B corporation focused on trying to rethink the design industry to be more sustainable and equitable. And again, I will give each of you opportunities to expand on that as we get this conversation started. Thank you all so much for joining me. I think we have all three of you now, it looks like. Wonderful. So I want to start by pointing out that I noticed something that the three of you have in common. So you come from different backgrounds of private sector and academia, but you all use the word human a lot to describe your work in various ways. So human-centered design, oriented toward human ecology, human scale. Those of us who play often in urbanism may be more familiar with kind of what those things mean. I think to an outsider, it may sort of be like, well, what do you mean? Of course, we're talking about a built environment here. Why wouldn't that be for humans? And of course, some of what you mean by that is the idea that the built environment needs to be for people, not cars, not profit, or all people, regardless of circumstance or ability. But I think actually expanding on that is a good frame for us to start this conversation. I'd like to start by having all of you address part of the description of this panel, which is to tell me just very briefly about one crucial way that how we design cities now is outdated, possibly not as human-oriented as you describe, and how we could be doing it differently right now. Just a small question. I'll start with you, Emily.
Well, I mean, when I say human, I mean the human body, literally. Like designing cities and function of this human shell that we have. And it's surprising to me that, we still are building cities in function of cars, even though the conversation has been so much about that's so wrong and we don't want that 1950s era, urban renewal stuff happening. Well, it is still happening. And there is a very powerful asphalt lobby. There's a very powerful road building lobby. Regional governments in the US are still very much focused on highway building. And so I think even though those of us in this game might be getting tired of constantly, harping on how we have to have pedestrian walkable cities, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we have a lot of work to do to change the narrative amongst all the people that are out there in the transportation sector in particular. I'm hoping the Biden administration and with Mayor Pete, that conversation will start to get a little more, nuanced and where we want it to be.
Okay, very good. Federico.
Well, hi, everyone. I think for us, the concept of human, I like to always sort of start conversations by saying that really the 20th century, when it comes to cities, was really about the car, and beyond, and to speak very clearly about what that means. We think about it spatially. So we're designers, we're architects, we're engineers. We're actually sort of out in the world trying to implement a lot of these things. And spatially, the ruling fauna of cities has been cars for a very, very long time, and not humans, not people, not citizens. And so things like the speed at which you traverse a city, things like, for example, the amount of space that it takes to store these things like the amount of infrastructure that it takes to maintain these things, from gas stations to parking lots to all of these things. All of these things have had a tremendous effect, especially in American cities. And what we like to say is that it's not that this is the way we design cities today. This is definitely the way that we still design cities today. But a lot of these methodologies, a lot of these standards really were adopted, post World War II, and even to this day, continue on. And so, in order for us to design the cities we want in the 21st century, we do have to shed a lot of the ways in which we design cities in the 20th century. So our company focuses, it's a new company, but this is really the charter of why we exist, is to bring this change, a fundamental change of scale to the cities that we have and the cities we want.
Mark.
Yeah, I sincerely appreciated Federico's use of the word fauna in his description of these urban places. We create ecology, right? I mean, I think of myself, I'm a real estate developer. I live at that intersection of where capital is deployed and where regulation comes to bear, and where design and innovation try to work their way through that heavily regulated and very, very conservative mechanism of capital deployment that has a massive, influence on how our cities actually ultimately appear. And I do think we can begin to spur more innovation if we start to analyze and assess the effects of our cities in a more biological frame of view. And again, I like to say that we are fundamentally human ecologists. I am in the business of manufacturing the human habitat. And if I don't observe how well the target species is functioning within the physical spaces that we are in the business of creating, then I'm missing the point. Now, I love what I do because I love trying to converge, capital, which is required to deploy these places, with the regulatory framework that exists for well-intended reasons, right? I mean, it's mostly there to protect us and to protect our life and our safety. But those things converge to create some pretty odd outcomes. I started our company in the late 90s, really with a purpose of trying to bring more innovation and a more open-minded sort of approach to it. But I can tell you right now, our industry is incredibly resistant to innovation. I mean, we build assets that have a 40 to 60 year payback. And so people go, look, you want to experiment with air conditioning, do it on that guy's building. I represent the teachers of the United States, and I don't really want to take a risk with their pension. And so the key is trying to sort of find incremental ways. I mean, the ones that we've been involved in that I'm kind of most proud of is we were the master developer of a $500 million transit infrastructure in the heart of downtown Denver. And we were able, by having our transit agency, who was kind of new to large scale, capital projects, sort of hand over leadership and guidance of that project to us, we were able to bring a tremendous amount of innovation to it. And, you know, in a very short period of time, we created a huge multimodal transit center that's been one of the more successful versions of a big mixed use transit center in the country. But boy, it was hard, and I don't want to do another one.
Mark, I want to start by following up on that a little bit, actually, and ask to those of you, the two of you in the private sector, but first to you, how do you fight those natural incentives that you referred to? What is it that you're doing that makes you more able to, you know, orient the broader human in your work when there's no financial incentive to do so? Is it because you're doing more work for the government? I take it's the project you described is partially funded by government, or what is the difference there?
Well, there's a lot embedded in that, and I'll just try to focus on a few components of it. But the way we designed ourselves to be able to be more nimble and innovative is we kept ourselves small. We're a small company that does very large scale projects. We've done several projects sort of in excess of $500 million. But, you know, the bigger my apparatus gets, the dumber my ideas, the dumber my thinking has to get. So what we do is we operate at a number of scales. We're doing a 7.5 acre site in downtown Los Angeles right now, in large measure due to the fact that this region committed $100 billion plus to a new transit system. And so we know that will change the mechanism and the ecology of that center city. So we want to be there to help shape and respond to that. But we're also building, I'm just releasing maybe the most interesting project I've done in the last 2 years is a new 4-unit single family house. You know, there's a tremendous amount of resistance to the densification of single family neighborhoods. So we hired an architect in Mexico City who did a really cool version of a 4-apartment single family home in a Denver neighborhood. And we literally just got the C of O this week. Honestly, that's where most of our innovation comes from, is on these small projects where we don't have to persuade a big institutional capital partner of what we're doing, where we can fund it with our own resources, learn from it, and then show people how it worked.
Yeah, that's interesting. So smaller projects. Federico, I'm wondering if you can chime in there too on how you think about making money on your doing good relative to what Mark just described.
Yeah, it's poignant to mention smaller projects. So our whole focus is, so we don't do greenfield at all. So our whole focus is adaptive reuse and retrofitting, which is where we spent most of our career. And so part of our goal, you know, we hear all these figures and all these numbers about growing cities, which is of course the case, but we also know a lot of that growth is happening, you know, outside of the U.S. Here, the problem that we have is equity, it's inclusiveness, it's affordability, it's climate, and we have to re-engineer what's already there much more so than just expand. And so what we're focusing on, frankly, is smallness. And part of our take with technology is that, you know, there was a time, and it's still very much the case, where sort of highest and biggest use and sort of the aggregation of a business case was fundamental to all development. And so we've, over the years, sort of really recognized that development, although a very powerful tool, is also a very blunt tool to use in our cities. And we needed something that's a bit more surgical, something that was smaller, something that was more community scale, something that could be deployed much more quickly. Because even with all of the money potentially that could be coming now to help cities, it still takes years to deploy that money. It takes, and sometimes even decades to do so. And the communities need a lot of this stuff now. And so our focus is, we do hundreds of projects, but they're actually really small. And so we standardize process, we standardize product, but we standardize it at a human scale. So we do a lot of things like electrification, you know, huge focus on decarbonation, the products that we're putting out there. We measure plastic content, for example. We try to reduce that. We don't do anything around fossil. We try to bias and over-index to renewable materials. We optimize for freight and supply chains. We do all of these kinds of things. We definitely use a lot of modular, some amazing companies around the country doing all of that kind of work, all in the service of having communities, almost having the ability, giving the ability to communities to reinvent themselves. There's a lot of work that does have to happen top down. You know, government is very important. We're fundamental believers in the role of government. We're also fundamental believers in the role of development, but communities also need tools. They need to be able to, to reinvent themselves and not always have to depend on these sort of outside entities to come in and help them in that way. So most of the work that we do is at that scale. And I'll give one example just because I know that they, they do sponsor this event, but one of our biggest customers right now is that we are helping REEF in this dream of turning thousands of parking lots and car infrastructure into parks, into nodes, into hubs that will become the sort of neighborhood infrastructure to support this sort of vision and idea of the 15-minute city. And so this is not one large project, it's actually hundreds or even thousands of little projects that very much optimize to the local fauna, if you will, to each individual community's needs, which is a super exciting project for us to be involved in now.
Yeah, thank you for those examples. Emily, I want to turn to you. You may have some thoughts about the notion of small scale projects as opposed to larger, and I would invite you to weigh in on that. I'm also going to ask you a new question. So,
Okay. Well, so this is a topic that interests me greatly. And in fact, I have a postdoc working on this very topic called incremental urbanism. And I'm going to ask him to interview both of you folks if he hasn't already. Mark and Federico, I hope you'll be willing to talk to him. Because this question of everything being so corporate and being so mega scale, and my worldview is about Chicago, and we are constantly getting these mega projects dumped on us with this very token feeling community engagement process where you show up at these meetings and you just feel like it's total lip service. And meanwhile, there's a sort of a splinter group of the new urbanists who formed this thing called lean urbanism, and they started collecting all kinds of materials and writings about that. They have a website. And so I think it's kind of ripe for, my whole thing in life is research. So it's kind of ripe for research. Like what are these different scales? When did we make this shift? What are really the impacts on things like affordability? Do we need the mega scale for affordability? How do we empower small scale city building and still achieve these bigger public goals? So all of those questions are absolutely key.
Yeah, absolutely. I suspected that you had that insight. I'm now going to ask a related question. So it's often been observed that the pandemic has been an opportunity to value some of these human scale things that we're talking about already, particularly walkability, to see what a world with fewer cars actually looks like, to the extent that it's not a value that's widely shared already. But it's also shown some of the limitations of these ideals. Some people are relying more on cars rather than on public transportation, and certainly the financial strains on a lot of these ideals, but particularly on public transportation, are very acute. And in fact, I'm going to bring in an audience comment on this that I think is relevant. If I could find it, somebody said that they just moved from the Netherlands to DC, and that they're frequently assaulted when biking here by people driving cars. Is the general American public ready for this post-car future? So to that end, my question for you, Emily, is whether you view the prospects for designing and fostering walkability differently in the wake of pandemic, whether more positively or negatively.
I don't think so. To me, the pandemic is going to be over a year from now in terms of our response to it. So I don't actually pay that much attention to, cities are going to be completely different now that the pandemic has come. I see it as some of the trends that were happening already. What the pandemic did was accelerate that, like throw fuel on the fire. Retailing. That was already declining. The storefront retail, especially in cities like Chicago, New York, and pandemic just fueled that. And some are surviving and some aren't. So that's another thing to research. But in terms, and then the other big accelerant on trends that were already happening, I think, is the affordability question. And to me, it was so great the last 10, 20 years to watch all this interest in walkability and pedestrian life and cities the way we always hoped they would be. And that was like ticking up and more interest. We used to talk 20 years ago, I'm really dating myself now, but 20 years ago, we talked about, oh boy, if we could just get like 25% of the population to be on board with the walkable urbanism agenda. And now it's more like the data coming out of places like Pew Research Center. It's 50%, you know. So the interest is more and more there. But what I worry about is so much, and it's coming down the pike. It already was, and now more so than ever, is of course what others have already mentioned, is that affordability piece. And the gentrification culture wars going on are just, maybe they're at a little bit of a lull right now because people are distracted with everything else, but they're coming back with a vengeance. And we need to be ready for that. And I think actually partly it's about getting more serious about affordability and walkable neighborhoods through innovations like the community land trust model is one of my favorites. But also, Federico mentioned this, and also Mark, I think, the need to empower neighborhood residents. We have no neighborhood planning in Chicago. I don't know about other cities. I think it's pretty weak. There are token engagement things going on, but really empowering neighborhoods to spend money and to have a budget and to be able to direct an engagement process, that is very lax in many cities in the US. And that is something that I think is really key to addressing these issues about these urban culture wars and fighting over space, and ensuring that everybody can have a piece of the good walkable urbanism that we all strive for.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to stick with that point for a minute. I think it's really important. I think you're right that, some of the gentrification conversations are stalled or different right now, but there are other, as you know, very prominent equity conversations going on across the board, especially in the US. And one of the interesting ways that manifested this year was a lot of cities that had limited streets to cars or closed down streets to cars, various slow streets programs, were actually opposed by a lot of residents and communities who didn't perceive the idea of making their streets safer in the same way. They felt that they had other more prominent safety issues. And I think a revelation for a lot of governments was this idea that they hadn't fully understood or engaged with the needs of those residents. And I'm wondering if you see other models for how they could have done that differently with they had this idea that everyone embraces walkability, but in fact that, wasn't the case even in these kind of urban places. And how should cities be thinking about those potentially conflicting values, or are they conflicting values really?
Well, it just completely breaks my heart that here are investments finally happening in street trees, in bike lanes, in all these basic qualities of urbanism that we desperately need, and people reacting against it for the very reasons you just cited. That breaks my heart, but I understand why that's happening, and that's a screwed up process. Why aren't people consulted? Why aren't they not only consulted but really empowered to be doing it? You can't, this top-down planning approach doesn't work. We've seen that time and time again. So it's disheartening that we haven't learned more about how to do it right.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I want to stay with affordability. Mark, you said in a recent interview elsewhere, I'm going to quote you, "We need to seize this moment to ensure that the densification of these cities includes an appropriate share of attainable rent stable housing." And I am not talking about 10% inclusionary ordinances, which for those of you who don't know is kind of like a typical developer way of incorporating affordable housing. So I'm wondering what you see as the path from your perspective to affordability. Does it come from the private sector and from your work, or are you thinking of government actors being more aggressive? And what's your role in that?
This is an area that we've spent a tremendous amount of time thinking about for the reasons that Emily referenced a moment ago. I mean, many of us have been involved in the advocacy for, you know, a shift of investment capital to our center cities for so many years. I mean, some of our younger associates, you know, they don't understand how devastated U.S. center cities were in the 1980s. They don't, I mean, they have no point of reference. I mean, you know, you can look at the old TV cop shows from the 1980s and pretty quickly get a sense for what was going on. And, you know, and that was the, you know, that was midway through about a 60 to 80 year, de-investment cycle that was really anomalous to the way human settlement generally occurred, you know, throughout all of known civilization. So we, you know, those of us that were sort of, you know, alert to these things knew there were problems and were tirelessly advocating for this shift. But candidly, we were fully unprepared for how, I mean, after having to move every grain of sand ourselves for 40 years, 30 years, you know, suddenly the market jumped in and the market said, we'll be there, we want this. And we were completely left flat-footed societally to deal with the, you know, I make the reference constantly to people in my office that, you know, some days I feel like the people that invented pesticide, you know, we solved hunger, but oh boy, we created a lot of other unintended consequence. And so, you know, what I do is in the work that we do, which involves a lot of very active public-private interaction. We have a large public site in downtown Portland, Oregon. It's a 14-acre site that is owned by the city. You know, it's the first redevelopment that their urban renewal agency is doing under a completely newly invented framework where they are presenting themselves as people who will not coercively displace, you know, community members, but they will in fact create equity through these projects. So we're, you know, we are deeply engaged in the political dynamic that is now caused by this displacement that has come from this rapid flow of prosperity back to center cities. And so our choice is to either sit on the sidelines and just sort of wait for somebody else to solve it, or to step in and try to find more equitable ways of impacting these neighborhoods. So we've started to create new ownership apparatuses. I know I can't lower the cost of housing. I dissed on my industry's capacity for innovation already. I mean, you know, the Empire State Building was built in 14 months. We are the only major industry that has lost productivity over the last 60 years. So it may happen in my kids' lifetime. It's not going to happen in my lifetime that we are going to find more efficient ways to physically construct buildings at significantly lower costs. So I got to work with what we have, and what I know I can work with is the cost of ownership. And the mechanism, I mean, we have these really interesting diagrams that we use to demonstrate how capital is not, you know, the US's capacity to consolidate capital to place into these cities is remarkable, right? It's one of the great miracles of our economy. But man, can it be destructive, because it has no concern for the impacts of these assets for the local neighbors that are involved. So we've started to create new ownership apparatuses at a large scale where the control over the long-term disposition of these assets rests squarely in the hands of the community and not in, you know, these large nameless, faceless capital providers that sort of float around our cities like part of the jet stream. So there's obviously a deep, very detailed set of discussions around that. But yes, that's where the innovation, in our view, has to happen. It has to happen in the ownership apparatus.
Interesting. Thank you. Federico, I want to ask you about a slightly different, but I think important topic. You had made a comment for those who are kind of entrepreneurs and innovators. I think in particular, you had made a comment in your company's manifesto that you once believed better technology would be a solution. I'm paraphrasing, so feel free to correct me. But that your company has realized that no new technology, this is a quote, applied atop traditional project delivery methods could be transformational. Technology must come with and in support of new and lightweight business models. Can you tell us about your journey from technology enthusiast to a skeptic of technology alone?
Sure. So I'll also give some credit to that reference to a very smart researcher, Daniel Davis, who I've worked with many times. But he and I actually worked together at a previous company I started when I was still in my 20s. So I worked at an architecture firm called Shop Architects in New York City, which is where I went to school for many years, and then broke off from there with some friends to start effectively a technology company. I would say one of the first that focused 100% of our scope on what I would call the sort of defragmentation of the very, very obfuscated process of delivering physical space. And that's a mouthful, and it was then, and it still is today. And we did that for several years. Worked with some really, really amazing companies that were really trying to do things, fundamentally differently. And then we ended up running, being acquired by a now infamous company called WeWork and ran all of their rollout. So joined there when there was maybe about 10 locations globally, left when there was about 600 of them. And a lot of this has to do with, I give this history mostly because it has to do with the fact that the best intentions, the best technology. I have a lot of friends that are, pure sort of what I would call tool making startups in our industry. Until we all very strategically go after the fundamental way in which buildings get built, not mechanically, but the business of doing that, then a lot of these tools are effectively just optimizing what was already there, which is a dated model, and it's a model that even contractually dates back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s here, even into the 80s a little bit. And so part of our big challenge and part of why innovation is slow in our industry is because it's this is a big country, and it's not a country, it's actually a collection of states that we really concern with. They're like the federal mandates are different from the state mandates, and they're different from the municipal mandates. And objectively, you need all of those players. And so it is a messy industry. I'll admit it's one that I love to death, the messiness, the ugliness, all of it, because of the fact that it has so much impact. Even those of us who, sort of like try to get more of this stuff out into the world quickly, I'd say we just never lose that vision, that want to get stuff out there. And for me and for us at Kanoa, it really starts with a fundamental belief that everything that we're talking about, the access to healthy workplaces, the access to healthy living, the access to healthy healthcare and healthy air is a fundamental human right, which I know is not shared by everybody, but we start from that line. If you don't believe in that, then there's all of these other kinds of things that come in it. But we start from that line because we think it's the right way to start from. And so when you say that, yeah, of course the private sector has a big role of that, and of course communities have a big role in that, but so does the government. There are times when investment needs to happen in places or in types of sectors that may not make monetary sense or financial sense at the time that it's being done. Like Mark mentioned, and we need that sort of equalizing force to step in and to do those things, because those humans we started this conversation with humans. Those humans are still there. So we'd say now we're going to wait 5, 6, 7 years for some of the changes that are going to come out of this recession. So not COVID, but the underlying recession that has come as a result of all of that. It's like, well, that's too long. 7 years for human is a lot of time. The same thing will happen with climate and the large movement of people that are going to come, climate refugees, and the large movement of people that are going to come as a result of that. And so we have to find as an industry ways to much more quickly address these issues. We have the blunt tools that take years and years, but we need other tools as well. And that's really what we do, like what we try to focus on every single day.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Speed is always a question. And actually we have a question about other kinds of speed that I'm going to throw to Emily related to that point. So for those of you who haven't been following along, this Aspen panel is the second in a series. And the first one was about the 15-minute city or neighborhood, which is this idea, a popular idea now, that you can walk or bike to all of your basic amenities or needs within 15 minutes of your home. And the question here is specifically, has there been any studies or research about how long it takes to fully form one of these neighborhoods? which is of course a hard question. Emily, I'll let you take a stab at it. But actually in conjunction with that, I would invite you, since the last panel was about 15-minute neighborhoods, if you have other spins on other ways of thinking about this that are alternatives to that you want to offer as worthy to think about, I would invite you to do that as well.
Do you realize how long we've been talking about something like the 15-minute city? I mean, I was hoping for the 5-minute city. What happened to that? The 5-minute neighborhood. No, it was back in the 19th century that these concepts were being percolated by Ebenezer Howard and Garden Cities folks. And then in the early 20th century, all the neighborhood theorizing about what needs to be in your neighborhood and the distances involved. And for the longest time, it was the 5-minute neighborhood. And you had the resources you needed right there. Well, that became unrealistic. And then, it got all blown out of whack with car-based urbanism coming into play. But it's just, although I love the 15-minute city and that it's getting new attention and exposure, because it's the basic idea of having access, to more people. That's sort of the basis of equity. And the more we can have that 15-minute accessibility pattern open to more people, I'm totally for it. But I think we do need to keep in mind it's been around a long time.
Absolutely. No, for sure. And I wonder if you have any other spins, but yes, I guess that's the 5-minute city, the 6 minutes. I think there's a 10-minute or a 20-minute. Okay, I've got another, I have a affordability question here from the audience, and I throw this to whoever wants to answer it. What insights does the panel have about how to keep construction projects affordable for the end user without depending on federal or state subsidies? How can costs be lowered? Small question.
Federico's probably got more optimism about that than I do.
I'm very optimistic about this.
Yeah, and the most, really the most innovation, the innovation that I have the most regard for is 100 and something years old, right? It's what Sears Catalog did for housing back in the early 1900s. It's so interesting that, we are still wrestling to try to create the same outcomes today. My daughter has she has a supportive housing, she's a supportive housing developer in Los Angeles. And she has gotten a bunch of innovation funding from the city of Los Angeles to build, homeless housing with service partners to, address innovation. And her whole platform is meant to be, and her whole funding source is meant to be around physical building innovation. So they've got 5 or 6 projects underway. Most of them are being built, with containers. But, they're still at like $425,000 a unit. And it's, this is hard work. This is really hard work. And it's work. I've been doing this for 30 something years, and this work is too hard for me. So it probably requires a fresh frame of mind. I sit on an organization that's based in Denver called the Biennial of the Americas. And we spend a lot of time traveling to cities, other large cities around our hemisphere, right? And I get so excited when I'm in some of these South American cities, where I go into some of these neighborhoods and these communities. There is this wonderful informality. There's a lot of mess in a lot of them too, right? Some of them have no sewer, no water, but there's some elements there that are amazing. But there is such a different formality and regulatory apparatus that is applied to that. And unpacking that, I mean, do you want to be the person to lighten seismic regulations in Los Angeles? Do you want to be the person to reduce fire protections in Colorado, wildfire neighborhoods? Do you want to, I mean, these things exist for reasons. And I think they're very, very challenging things to unpack.
Thank you. Well, on that complex note, I think we're going to wrap it up. These insights have been incredible. I love the synergies between the three of you on the idea of incremental development in particular. So glad that you all could join us. And I think I'm going to throw it back to Tim to close the webinar.